What if the map of post-war Europe had unfolded differently? What if Prussia, the ancient forge of German discipline and culture, had not vanished beneath Soviet conquest, but endured behind the Iron Curtain as a strange hybrid of East and West? Imagine a world where the red flag rose over Königsberg, not as a symbol of destruction, but as the banner of a new, uneasy experiment, the Prussian Soviet Republic. This is the story of that world. When the guns fell silent in 1945, millions of ethnic Germans were already on the road, a defeated people trudging westward through smoke, mud, and ruins. They were leaving behind not just villages and farms, but whole centuries of heritage. In Bohemia, Silesia, East Prussia, and the Baltic lands, towns that had spoken German for generations were suddenly emptied, their churches abandoned, their cemeteries left untended. Among all these losses, none symbolized the death of old Germany more than the fall of Königsberg, the medieval capital of Prussia, the city of philosophers, soldiers, and kings. Once home to Immanuel Kant and the coronations of Prussian monarchs, it became a ghost city under Soviet artillery. Those who survived fled west, terrified of the approaching Red Army and its reputation for vengeance. The Soviets soon occupied the ruins, erasing the old name and christening it Königsberg, later Kaliningrad. To many Germans, it was as though their civilization had been amputated from the map. But in this alternate timeline, things took a subtle yet profound turn. The difference began in 1941, when Soviet intelligence, heeding British warnings about Hitler's coming invasion, prepared more effectively for Operation Barbarossa. When the German assault came, it was still devastating, but the Soviets held longer and fell back in better order. The Wehrmacht advanced deep into the USSR, but their momentum broke along the Dnieper River. There, the front hardened into a stalemate, a brutal corridor of trenches, artillery, and attrition. Both sides bled endlessly, but the Soviets had learned patience. They knew Germany's industry ran on borrowed time, its fuel stores dwindling, its manpower shrinking. As the Western Allies landed in Italy and later in Normandy, the Soviet strategy became simple: hold, endure, and let the Reich burn itself out. By 1945, Berlin still fell, but Moscow was spared the devastation that had scarred it in our own history. Because the Red Army had not seen its homeland completely ravaged, Stalin's retribution was tempered. The scorched earth fury that erased East Prussia was replaced with cold pragmatism. When the front collapsed, fewer East Prussians fled. Of the original 2.5 million who had once lived there, nearly 900,000 remained, clinging to their farms and seaside towns, wary yet unwilling to abandon their homeland. At the Potsdam Conference, where Truman, Attlee, and Stalin redrew the frontiers of Europe, the question of Prussia became a diplomatic puzzle. Truman, eager to soften the occupation and win German trust, argued that East Prussia, the symbolic cradle of Teutonic culture, should not be emptied of its people. Stalin listened, calculating. The Soviet Union had no intention of relinquishing the region, but he recognized its strategic value. The Baltic Fleet needed a year-round port, for Leningrad froze each winter. The harbor of Pillau was indispensable. The compromise was unprecedented. East Prussia would not join the new communist Poland, nor would it merge with East Germany. Instead, it would become a Prussian Soviet Socialist Republic, directly within the USSR, but administratively distinct from any German state. It was a contradiction, a communist Prussia built upon the ruins of militarism, governed by Moscow, yet inhabited largely by Germans. For Stalin, this was both a reward and a weapon. It kept the Baltic coast under Soviet control while preventing any future unification of Germany. For Truman, it was a propaganda victory, a gesture that showed the West still cared about the fate of ordinary Germans. Poland, however, was outraged. The idea of a German exclave on its doorstep terrified Warsaw. To pacify Polish anger, the Soviets expanded Poland westward. The free city of Danzig, neutral before the war, was handed to Poland, though it had never historically belonged to it. Likewise, Lithuania was rewarded with the port of Klaipėda, annexed to the Lithuanian SSR despite its German past. Meanwhile, the new Prussian SSR kept regions like Warmia and Masuria, making it roughly the size of Belgium, about 37,000 square kilometers. Most of the remaining Polish families there were relocated to newly repolonized territories in Silesia and Pomerania, while displaced Slavs from Belarus and Ukraine filled the emptied towns. By the late 1940s, the borders of Europe had settled into a shape almost identical to our own, except for one anomaly glowing red on the Baltic coast: Prussia reborn. Yet Stalin's ambitions did not end at geography. Within the Soviet Union, another German community remained, the Volga Germans. Descendants of settlers invited by Catherine the Great in the 18th century to cultivate the fertile plains of the Volga River. They had lived for nearly 2 centuries in relative autonomy, speaking a dialect of Low German touched by Russian rhythm. But Stalin distrusted them deeply. During the war, he dissolved their autonomous republic and deported thousands to Siberia and Kazakhstan, fearing collaboration with the Nazis. Now, the existence of the Prussian SSR gave him a new solution. He ordered the resettlement of surviving Volga Germans westward to the Baltic frontier, a vast migration across forests, rivers, and tundra. By 1946, nearly 2.4 million Germans, both native East Prussians and exiled Volga Germans, lived in the new republic. Entire villages rose from the rubble under the supervision of Soviet engineers and German labor. Schools taught in Russian and German. Propaganda posters mixed Marx and Frederick the Great. It was an ideological experiment, half German, half Soviet, neither trusted by Berlin nor Moscow. Königsberg itself was rebuilt as a model communist city and renamed Konin, after Mikhail Kalinin, the Soviet statesman whose name also honored the Kalinin Front during the war. The change was deliberate. Konin sounded German enough to preserve continuity, but Russian enough to erase memory. It was both homage and erasure, the Soviet way of rewriting history without admitting it. Would such a Prussian republic have survived the fall of the USSR? Would it have chosen to rejoin Germany after 1991, or stood defiantly as a Russian enclave on the Baltic, like Kaliningrad today, but with a German soul beneath the surface? No one can say. But in this alternate world, Prussia did not die in 1945. It endured, reshaped, repurposed, and reborn beneath the Red Star, a ghost of empire haunting the edge of Europe. When the Prussian Soviet Socialist Republic was established, its survival depended on a single line of ink, a 99-year lease signed with the Russian SFSR, granting Moscow full control over the strategic port of Pillau. Officially, it was temporary cooperation. In truth, it was occupation disguised as partnership. Within months, Soviet engineers arrived to rebuild the shattered coastline. What had once been fishing villages and merchant harbors became a sprawl of military infrastructure, dry docks, submarine pens, missile depots, and radar towers aimed at the west. Pillau transformed into a fortress, a silent dagger pointed toward the Baltic Sea. Russian sailors flooded the region, followed by their families, teachers, and administrators. By the late 1950s, ethnic Russians made up nearly 15% of the republic's population, mirroring the demographic shift already taking place in Latvia and Estonia. The Prussian SSR was no longer merely a satellite, it was being methodically absorbed. The newcomers brought their language, their Orthodox churches, and their Soviet symbols. Red banners hung from buildings that once bore the Black Eagle of Prussia. The sound of the German tongue faded from city squares, replaced by the bark of Russian commands. The port city that once echoed with Prussian discipline now marched to Moscow's tune. As part of the USSR, Prussia's militarism, the very trait that had defined its history, was deliberately erased. Veterans' parades were banned. The singing of Prussian marches, the display of old uniforms, even the possession of medals from imperial times became criminal offenses. The past was now subversive. The message was clear. There would be no resurrection of the Iron Kingdom. Even Königsberg Castle, the beating heart of Prussian identity, was caught in this ideological war. Severely damaged during the final battles of the war, it could easily have been demolished. Many expected it, but Moscow hesitated. Destroying the castle risked inflaming the very nationalism the Soviets feared. So they rebuilt it, not as a royal seat, but as a government palace wrapped in socialist realism. Its Gothic towers were reconstructed with angular Soviet rigidity, and portraits of Prussian kings were replaced by murals of Lenin and Marx. It stood as a grim metaphor: Prussian stone, Soviet soul. Meanwhile, deep inside the Republic, another quiet transformation was unfolding. The resettlement of Volga Germans, ethnic Germans uprooted from Russia's interior, had begun to reshape the population. They spoke a Low German dialect heavily infused with Russian words, a linguistic relic of their centuries along the Volga River. When they arrived, communication with the native Prussians was strained. The Prussians, proud and educated, regarded them as unsophisticated peasants molded by Soviet ideology. But years passed, and necessity softened contempt. The Volga settlers were industrious, adaptable, and resilient, qualities the Prussians respected. Intermarriage blurred lines, and in time their languages fused. Scholars later called it New Prussian, a dialect born of survival, half-disciplined High German, half-weathered Volga speech, peppered with Russian idioms. It became the everyday tongue of markets, schools, and factories, a linguistic monument to endurance under empire. Moscow, however, feared any sign of cohesion. The Kremlin's great obsession was preventing Prussian identity from ever again linking itself to German nationalism. And so, a deliberate campaign of historical re-engineering began. Soviet historians proclaimed that the true Prussians were not Germans at all, but an ancient Baltic Slavic people whose culture had been corrupted by Teutonic invaders in the Middle Ages. Textbooks claimed that the Teutonic Knights had enslaved the local tribes, eradicated their native faith, and imposed German Christianity by fire and sword. Under this new mythology, modern Germans became villains, while Prussians were recast as victims of centuries of cultural genocide. Churches were shut down. The Prussian Union of Churches, founded in 1817 by King Frederick Wilhelm III, was banned for spreading capitalist lies. Even children were taught to hate the very nation their ancestors had built. But as so often in history, oppression bred defiance. The more Moscow pushed its fiction, the more people whispered the truth. Among the educated elite and old families arose a cultural underground, the Teutons, as they called themselves. They preserved banned books, sang forbidden hymns, and secretly celebrated the birthdays of their former kings. In their eyes, the Prussian Kaiser was not a memory, but a beacon, the lost ruler who had once united Germany and defeated the Russians in the First World War. They saw the Second World War not as a German betrayal of Prussia, but as a distortion, a hijacking of Prussian honor by National Socialism. To them, Hitler had destroyed what Bismarck had built. Their dream was not revenge, but restoration, the rebirth of a moral, disciplined, independent Prussia, free from Moscow's grasp. Yet the Soviet plan produced not one identity, but several. The Volga Germans, once mistrusted by both Russians and Prussians, began developing their own mythology. They mixed Lutheran beliefs with fragments of Baltic folklore, creating a strange syncretic culture, half Christian, half pagan, wholly alien to the Kremlin's secular vision. Ironically, the Soviet attempt to suppress nationalism only birthed more of it, fractal and uncontrollable. By the 1970s, the Prussian SSR existed in quiet tension. Its people smiled in public, spoke carefully, and dreamed in private. The KGB monitored everything: libraries, churches, even classrooms. A misplaced word could mean exile to Siberia. Yet in the small details, the carved eagle on a doorframe, the tune of an old hymn hummed while working, fragments of the old spirit endured. Economically, Prussia sat in the uneasy middle of the Soviet world. Its shipyards, fisheries, and railways gave it a slightly higher standard of living than the average Soviet republic, but nowhere near that of East Germany. The ports bustled, the factories smoked, and yet there was an invisible ceiling. No matter how hard they worked, true prosperity remained forbidden. Still, compared to the poverty of Belarus or the chaos of Ukraine, life in the Prussian SSR felt almost stable. That illusion ended in the late 1980s. Across the Soviet Union, cracks were spreading. The Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, began demanding independence. Gorbachev's reforms weakened Moscow's grip, and the world watched the Eastern Bloc unravel. Then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and the tremor reached Konin. Within days, demonstrations filled the streets. Students and veterans marched under the black and white flag of the old Prussian kingdom, chanting, "Wir sind Preußen," "We are Prussians." The capital's Soviet statues were toppled, and the city reclaimed its ancient name, Königsberg, once again. In 1990, inspired by their Baltic neighbors, the Prussian SSR declared independence from the crumbling USSR. The event sent shockwaves through Europe. Red banners were torn down, royal insignias reappeared, and the royal anthem echoed in the streets for the first time since 1945. The Soviets threatened military intervention. Tanks were positioned along the border, but history was moving faster than Moscow could react. Only weeks later, Russia itself declared independence from the USSR on June 12, 1990, leaving Prussia effectively free. Yet freedom brought a new dilemma. What now? The new nation was divided. Some called for immediate reunification with Germany, arguing that Prussia was the spiritual heart of the German world. Others, scarred by decades of control, wanted nothing to do with Berlin, fearing domination by another power, just under a different flag. Poland and Western Europe, wary of reigniting territorial disputes, openly opposed unification. In July 1990, a national referendum was held. The results were decisive. Only 28% voted for joining Germany. The majority chose independence. And so, the world witnessed something unthinkable: the rebirth of an independent Prussian republic, internationally recognized and free for the first time in nearly half a century. Its existence eased Polish fears of a revived Polish corridor and marked the final closure of Europe's oldest wound. Yet, beyond the politics, there lingered a haunting truth. Empires may die, borders may shift, ideologies may fade, but some identities refuse to vanish. Against all odds, Prussia, forged in steel, broken by war, buried by communism, had risen again from the ashes, not as conqueror or victim, but as survivor. When the Cold War ended, Prussia stood at a crossroads, a small nation reborn from the wreckage of ideologies, surrounded by giants still struggling to understand it. For decades, the Prussian Soviet Republic had existed as a paradox, German in culture, Soviet in structure, and estranged from both worlds. Now, with the Iron Curtain lifted, it faced the monumental task of defining what it truly was. Relations with the newly unified Federal Republic of Germany were uneasy. The scars of division ran deep. The Teutons, who had preserved their culture through the darkness of Soviet rule, looked westward with resentment, convinced that Germany had abandoned them when they needed it most. They saw a nation that had renounced its pride, wrapped in guilt, and afraid of its own history. The Russified Prussians, by contrast, descendants of settlers and soldiers, had little emotional tie to Berlin. They feared the chaos of reunification and preferred stability under their own flag. And the Russian minority, nearly a fifth of the population, felt no desire to merge with a Germany they viewed as culturally foreign and politically arrogant. The reunified German state, eager to maintain peace, signed the treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany, renouncing all territorial claims, including Prussia. Yet in diplomatic language, a quiet clause was buried deep within. Should Prussia, of its own accord, choose one day to join the German Federation, it would be welcomed. It was a door left slightly ajar, one history would never open. Even before the ink dried on the treaty, new tensions surfaced. The Russian Navy still operated from its long-established bases along the Prussian coast. The port of Pillau, once the symbol of Prussian sea power, now bristled with Soviet submarines. Prussia's independence was real on paper, but Moscow's shadow lingered across the horizon. Diplomats argued for months. The young Prussian state demanded full withdrawal. The Russians insisted on security guarantees. Eventually, President Boris Yeltsin agreed. The withdrawal would occur in waves over 5 years, provided Prussia promised never to join NATO. That agreement, signed in late 1991, became the cornerstone of Prussian neutrality, a principle that would define its foreign policy for decades. And then, just as it had centuries before, the question arose, what form should this nation take? Republican voices called for a parliamentary democracy modeled after West Germany. Others, the traditionalists, the Teutons, the monarchists, argued that Prussia's strength had always been its continuity, its discipline, its crown. The debate consumed the nation. For the first time in generations, public squares filled not with slogans imposed by a distant power, but with genuine arguments about destiny. Finally, a referendum was held. The result shocked the world. 74% of Prussians voted to restore the monarchy. On January 18, 1991, the halls of Königsberg Castle shone with candlelight once again. Snow drifted across the rooftops as choirs sang in the old German tongue. Within those stone walls, the same place where Frederick I had crowned himself nearly 3 centuries earlier, a frail yet dignified man stepped forward. He was Louis Ferdinand, grandson of Kaiser Wilhelm II, exiled heir to a throne thought forever lost. At 83 years old, he had witnessed the fall of empires, 2 world wars, and the burial of the German crown. Now, against all expectations, he returned not as emperor, but as King Louis Ferdinand I of Prussia. The coronation was both spectacle and statement. Bells rang from churches that had been silent for half a century. Crowds filled the castle square, waving black and white flags of the Old Kingdom. Even Berlin watched in fascination as the Black Eagle banner once again fluttered above Königsberg's skyline. Louis Ferdinand addressed his people with trembling hands. Prussia was not born of conquest, it was born of will, the will to rise again when all else has fallen. His reign began with a declaration of limits. There would be no claims to the German Empire, no ambitions beyond the Baltic. Prussia would stand not as successor to the Kaiserreich, but as guardian of its heritage, cleansed of ideology, rooted in culture. The new constitution, inspired by the 1850 Prussian model, established a bicameral Landtag. The upper chamber, the House of Nobles, served as an advisory council to the crown, while the House of Deputies represented the people. The king retained veto power, the right to appoint a chancellor, and command of the armed forces. Yet within this monarchy, freedom flourished. Universal suffrage, freedom of speech, religion, and press were guaranteed by law. It was a strange creature, neither old nor new, neither autocratic nor liberal, a constitutional monarchy built from the ashes of socialism. But not everyone celebrated. In Germany, intellectuals mocked the coronation as anachronism dressed in gold. The liberal press saw it as a retreat into nostalgia. Even some former East Germans, newly freed from communism, viewed Prussia's rebirth as an uncomfortable reminder of the militarism that had once defined their identity. Yet to the Prussians, that identity was not a curse, it was redemption. While post-war Germany struggled with shame, Prussia rediscovered pride. Its leaders spoke openly of honor, discipline, and duty, not as tools of oppression, but as virtues that had once built Europe's greatest state. The Black Eagle returned to the national seal. The civil flag of 1701, white with the black cross, became the symbol of unity. The royal banner, bearing the crown and eagle, adorned government buildings and military parades. The Pickelhaube, long a forbidden relic, reappeared in ceremonial uniforms. Military marches, once banned as imperialist, were played in public again, no longer weapons of propaganda, but songs of memory. Louis Ferdinand's reign was short but symbolic. His greatest legacy was the restoration of Königsberg Castle, rebuilt stone by stone into a mirror of its 18th century glory. He lived long enough to see its spires rise again before passing away in 1994, his funeral drawing millions to the capital. His grandson, George Friedrich, only 18, ascended the throne as King George IV, the first monarch of Prussia born free. While his grandfather had revived the past, Georg looked toward the future. He embarked on a campaign to modernize the kingdom, economically, culturally, and politically. He opened diplomatic channels with Poland, Lithuania, and Germany, dispelling fears of irredentism. "Our task," he declared, "is not to redraw maps, but to rebuild bridges." Under his leadership, Prussia embraced free market capitalism. The royal family's remaining fortune was invested directly into infrastructure, roads, ports, and schools. Economic advisors from Scandinavia and West Germany arrived to design an efficient tax system and attract foreign investors. Prussia's greatest resource, however, lay beneath its soil. With over 90% of the world's amber deposits, it became the Amber Kingdom, exporting millions in jewelry, resins, and natural chemicals each year. Its amber trade, combined with agriculture and shipbuilding, formed the backbone of a growing economy. By 2003, long-standing legal disputes with Germany over royal assets were resolved. Thousands of paintings, manuscripts, and sculptures looted or confiscated since 1918 were returned to the House of Hohenzollern, along with 2.6 billion euros in compensation for seized estates. Rather than keeping the money, the young king invested it into the nation's museums, universities, and public libraries. The transformation was remarkable. By the early 2000s, Königsberg, now a glittering city of restored Baroque facades and modern glass architecture, had become one of Europe's most beautiful capitals. Its streets hummed with art, scholarship, and innovation. The university, reopened under its original name Albertina, reclaimed its place as a center of philosophy and science. In 2004, Prussia officially joined the European Union. It was a moment of poetic symmetry. The same state that had once dominated Europe through arms now entered it through peace. King George IV became one of the EU's strongest advocates, calling it the new Holy Roman Empire, bound not by crowns, but by cooperation. Yet he held firm to Prussia's independence. The kingdom refused NATO membership, honoring the neutrality pact with Moscow. Russia remained an essential trading partner, supplying natural gas in exchange for Prussian-manufactured goods and amber-based technologies. The Reichstaler, Prussia's own currency, remained in circulation. The euro was never adopted, a deliberate statement of sovereignty in an increasingly homogenized Europe. Through the 2010s, Prussia quietly flourished. Its literacy rate topped 99%, unemployment fell below 3%, and its Human Development Index ranked among the top 5 in Europe. Tourism boomed. Millions came each year to see the reborn castle, the amber museums, and the elegant streets where history and modernity walked hand in hand. Prussia, once the spearhead of empire, had become the heart of peace. In this alternate century, the world learned a strange truth. Empires may collapse, but identity endures. The Black Eagle, once feared across continents, now stood for something far gentler: endurance, integrity, and rebirth. Prussia had lived through monarchy and fascism, communism and chaos, and still emerged standing. A nation once defined by conquest had conquered the one enemy no power could defeat: time. And so, on the banks of the Pregel River, as the sun sets over the restored spires of Königsberg Castle, one can still hear the echo of Frederick's words, carried by the wind. Prussia is not a place, it is a spirit, and the spirit cannot die.